introduction, please. As most of you know, I'm Craig Snyder, the president of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening for the first World Affairs Council program of 2019, which is, I'm delighted to say, this organization's 70th anniversary year. For all these 70 years, we have followed the construct of one of the architects of the intellectual and moral structure of modern representative government, the philosopher John Stuart Mill, that a free society is based on a marketplace of ideas. For all of these 70 years, we have been one of the country's corner stalls in America's free market of ideas, believing after John Stuart Mill when he said, and I quote, "The only way in which a human being can make some approach to knowing the whole of a subject is by hearing what can be said about it by persons of every variety of opinion and studying all modes in which it can be looked at by every character of mind," end quote. Put another way, a little more simply, as many of us, I think, learned as kids, free speech requires respecting and defending the freedom to speak of others regardless of whether one finds their ideas right or wrong. Thus, the Council has chosen for its 70th anniversary motto, three simple words: democracy demands discourse. We're here this evening for discourse concerning the ideas of Stephen K. Bannon, one of the most controversial and consequential polemicists of our time. Former White House chief strategist and senior counselor for President Trump, Mr. Bannon's ideas on what he calls populism and economic nationalism have global reach and impact. Former CEO of the Trump campaign, former executive chairman of Breitbart News, Mr. Bannon was educated in national security studies at Georgetown University and in business administration at Harvard. He was a surface warfare officer and special assistant to the Chief of Naval Operations during his service in the United States Navy. Mr. Bannon will make some opening remarks, offering his take on one of the most important issues of our time, the relationship between the United States and China. And then we'll have a wide-ranging conversation on any number of issues of the day. For the concluding section of our program this evening, I will be asking Mr. Bannon questions posed by you. So I ask that you please write your questions on 3x5 cards provided at your seats, and staff will be around to collect them in a bit. So with that, please join me and the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia in welcoming Steve Bannon.
Thank you. I want to thank the World Affairs Council, Philadelphia, for inviting me. Historic day. Very historic day. In England, I guess most of you know about the Brexit vote, right? Biggest defeat for a prime minister on a major piece of legislation since 1924. You got to remember, Brexit, go back to the summer of 2016. Nobody thought, particularly in April and May, nobody thought Brexit would happen. It wasn't even going to be close. I think it was down 7 points, and Donald Trump was down by a lot. Brexit and 2016 election in the United States are inextricably linked. I happen to be at both of those. We'd started Breitbart London a couple of years before, specifically to cover this whole issue about the European Union, what impact it had on freedom-loving people, and obviously with Trump. Brexit and 2016 are inextricably linked, but how are they linked? They're linked because of China. It's the exporting of Chinese overcapacity and Chinese deflation that gutted and has gutted the industrial West. And those votes, remember, Brexit was passed because of labor votes up in the Midland counties of the United Kingdom. It was labor votes late in the evening that drove the difference in Brexit, and it was what the pollsters missed. Why? All the jobs, all the industrial jobs have left. The same thing with Donald Trump. When I stepped into the Trump campaign in mid-August, I think it was what? Pick it, 10, 12, 16 down, double digits down every battleground state. Hillary Clinton wasn't even campaigning, remember? She was on the beach or fundraising. They weren't putting a lot of pressure on Obama about Merrick Garland because the simple fact that they wanted a more liberal, progressive justice on the Supreme Court. This was going to be a blowout of historic proportions. When I first took over the campaign, I told the candidate, don't worry about the polling, don't worry about the 12 or 14 or 16 down, don't worry about the double digits down every battleground state. Only two numbers matter. 2/3, 1/3, right track, wrong track. 2/3 still thought we were on the wrong track. Same number Barack Obama won on. They admired President Obama. They admired President Obama's wife. They did not think he was the agent of change to turn the country around. Most important number, though, was Pat Caddell had been doing this analysis for many, many years. For the first time in American history, 70% of your countrymen believed America was in decline. And working class people and lower middle class people were adamant. They thought that the elites of the country were comfortable with that, and they were not comfortable with it. And they would follow a leader that promised through action to return America to her former glory. And I said, we're going to simplify this campaign. 3 things. Number 1, we're going to stop mass illegal immigration, limit legal immigration to protect our sovereignty and our workers. The Black and Hispanic working class, they're the ones most victimized by mass illegal immigration. And our tech workers on these restrictions on legal immigration that we need. Number 2 is we're going to bring back jobs from China, high value added manufacturing jobs. And number 3, we're going to get out of these pointless foreign wars. We're at war with China. We're at war with the greatest power we've ever had to confront. And we're 15, 16, 17, 18, 20 years into this. And it's going to take groups like the World Affairs Council in Philadelphia, one of the great historic cities in America, to understand this and to get the word out. We're not at war with the Chinese people. We're not even at war with the nation of China. We're at war with a radical cadre of the Chinese Communist Party, personified by President Xi, individuals like Wan Xishan, Li Hu, other names that you will start to get familiar with in the years ahead. They're not shy about the war. In fact, they published a book in 1999. If you have any book to buy and read, it's this. Kind of difficult to get. I think on Amazon it costs, I don't know, 60, 70 bucks. I think the Naval Academy and Naval Institute Press published the first one in 2002. It's written in 1999, right after China got most favored nations and got into the WTO. These 2 individuals, 2 colonels, it's called Unrestricted Warfare. 2 colonels in the Chinese and the PLA wrote it. They talked about, it's a very dense book, very hard to understand, the most important book on military strategy since Clausewitz. They talk about there's 3 types of war. There's information war, there's economic war, and there's kinetic war. And they project out over the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. They said it's obvious that these 2 systems, a totalitarian Confucius, mercantilist system, and the liberal democratic West are going to be on a collision course. First in the Western Pacific, then on the landmass of Asia, and then throughout the world. And if they have to get into kinetic war with the West, they have lost. So like Sun Tzu, they said, we can never allow ourselves to get sucked into the vortex of a traditional military conflict with the West. It's information war and cyber war and economic war. And that's where the entire process of One Belt, One Road, Made in China 2025, all these buzzwords you've heard about, started to come into place. For 300, 400 years, we've had a system called the Westphalian System, based upon the nation state, okay? What the Chinese are advocating is a radically different system. And this system was personified in the week of President Trump's inauguration. Go back to January 2017. Early in the week on Wednesday, President Xi goes to Davos, right? The high church of globalization, gives a speech, and they are praising him, that this is the new model. This is really the proponents of globalization. Go back and read The Economist, read the Financial Times, read the Wall Street Journal. President Trump comes that same week. They talk about it as the American Carnage speech, but what he made was a defense of the nation state. The nation state is a unit of sovereignty, and really supported this Westphalian system that's worked for 300 years for the betterment of mankind, even with the speed bumps we've hit. You've heard all this thing about Trump being a disruptor. Let's talk about what the system is today. It's called the International Rules-Based Liberal Democratic Order. You've heard about it, if you've watched Morning Joe, you'll see Richard Haas and David Ignatius mocking and ridiculing Donald Trump every day, right? Admiral Stavridis, that whole posse. CNN, MSNBC. What is that? It's a system of commercial relationships, capital markets, trade deals, and an American security guarantee from Europe, NATO, to the Persian Gulf, to the South China Sea, up to the Northwest Pacific. Where the central idea of American national security and foreign policy for almost 100 years has been that we will never allow one central power to control the landmass of Asia or Eurasia. Now, what Donald Trump said is that in this international rules-based order, right now, it's something that our founders never intended and we never intended it to be. It is literally a series of protectorates from NATO to the Persian Gulf, to the South China Sea, to the Northwest Pacific. These are not allies. They're protectorates. Remember, we have a $1 trillion defense budget. It's not $780 billion. That's the face amount. When you add in all the overhead, you add all the other charges, you add all the other departments, Department of Energy, you add it all up, it's $1 trillion. It just so happens to equate to our annual deficit, right? Which is a structural deficit that's going to go on in perpetuity. And that's because of American obligations in NATO, in the Persian Gulf, in the South China Sea, in the Northwest Pacific. And all Trump said, and this is the revolutionary thing he said, he's not an isolationist. He's the exact opposite. He says, where it's in the vital national security interests of the United States, it'll be in the vital national security interests of our allies in that area. So yes, NATO, it's got to be 2%, right? You got to start paying your freight. You got to spend it on operations and equipment and interoperability. Persian Gulf, we go to Riyadh. Why? To begin the formation of a Middle East strategic alliance with Israel, in Jordan, in Egypt, in the UAE, in Kuwait, in Saudi Arabia. Against what? Persian or Iranian expansion. In the South China Sea, the aircraft carriers of the 9 islands they've made, which are central aircraft carriers. I know this as 21-year-old, 22-year-old. I was a junior officer on a destroyer that steamed the South China Sea, keeping those sea lanes open. But back in those days, we went with our radars up, our guns turning. Under President Obama and Bush, that didn't happen. Safe navigation because the Chinese had built islands down there and started to exert their influence on what they think, excuse me, is a territorial internal sea. And then in the Northwest Pacific, Korea, Japan, not coming anywhere close to the cost of the defense of the Northwest Pacific. And what Trump said is economic security and military security are combined for national security. We can't be upside down on trade deals with the EU. We can't be upside down in the Persian Gulf. We can't be upside down in the South China Sea or the Northwest Pacific. We need a new trade deal with Japan. We need a new trade deal with Korea. The guys and the nations in the South China Sea got to put a little something in the hopper. There's got to be a new deal with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And Europe has got to start to pull their weight. That's the revolution of Donald Trump, and that is why he's hated and detested. I should say that's one of the reasons he's hated and detested. If you go around and listen to this stuff all the time, of all this highfalutin talk about our values, look, I understand. We have the same values, we believe in this, but values mean something when decisions get made. And here's what the deplorables were telling the nation and the world. It's their money that underwrites that. But more importantly, it's their kids at the 38th parallel. It's their kids on those ships in the South China Sea. I know, I served with them. It's their kids in the Persian Gulf. I know because my daughter, a West Point grad, was an officer in the 101st Airborne in Iraq. When her non-commissioned officers are Hispanic and African American that never had any benefit from the system. It's their kids. It's their kids up there in the Ukraine, right? They don't want it anymore. They want a new deal. The whole system rests on their shoulder. And they don't want to hear Richard Haas. They don't want to hear David Ignatius. They don't hear all these elites that mock and ridicule them when it's their money and their kids. And that's what Donald Trump gave a voice to. Now, the Chinese plan is ambitious. One Belt, One Road is more than just a geopolitical expansion. If you know Mackinder, and I know most of you do here, that come to the World Affairs Council, that's the Scottish strategist that talked about the Eurasian landmass and who controls that landmass, the world island, can control the world. And that's why Napoleon and Hitler and Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great, they're all heading in the same direction, right? But it's more than that. It's to break the Westphalian system of individual nation states. What they've used is the British East India Company model of predatory capitalism. Remember, the Chinese have not been one entity for 4,000 years because they don't understand how to have barbarian management, right? They have barbarian management of the United States. We'll get to that in a minute. They look at us as a tributary state, just like they look at Pakistan as a tributary state. We are Jamestown to their Great Britain. It's one of the reasons the trade thing is so not just far off, there's no easy solution. We send them soybeans, we send them grain, we send them cattle, we send them hogs, we send them natural gas, we send them Apple products and Boeing jets. Oh, excuse me. We don't send them Apple products and Boeing jets. They manufacture all the Apple products there. Now in their joint venture with Boeing, they manufacture all the Boeing plants there, or planes there, just like they do the cars. And One Belt, One Road is to break that and turn that into a network of administrative units of which they're the central decision maker. Xi told us this in his 18th Party Congress speech. It went 3.5 hours. 3.5 hours. This is the greatest enemy we've ever had. And I don't know 10 people in Washington that have read that entire 100-page speech, which they very specifically lay out what they're going to do. the Western media, CNN, BBC, they picked the former Chinese president who looked at his watch because it took so long and fell asleep a couple of times. It's supposed to be very funny. She walks through the end of the Westphalian System, the end of the nation state, in China's new program that turned these into administrative units. Their other plan, looking at us as a tributary state, and where the cutting edge of the war is made in China 2025. You've all heard about it. What does it stand for? Here's what it stands for. Through forced technology transfers and intellectual property theft, and remember, the intellectual property theft pales in comparison to the forced technology transfer. In other words, gets access to the market, we essentially have to turn over our IP so they can recreate it. Made in China 2025 is where they're going to go advanced chip design, artificial intelligence, robotics, maybe even genetic engineering. The conversion of that is going to be modern manufacturing, of which they're going to own, and they're going to sell back to you. A totally audacious plan when it was conceived. But until Donald Trump arrived, it was going to succeed. The elites, the David Ignatius and the Morning Joe crowd mock and ridicule Trump. They got this thing, I'm sure you've heard of it. The Thucydides trap. Heard of the Thucydides trap? This is this concept put out by Graham Allison, the great strategist of the Cold War, the nuclear strategist, and Henry Kissinger. Talks about the Peloponnesian War. You have a rising power and a declining power, 16 times in world history. 12 times, I think, has led to a catastrophic military conflict. 4 times, I think it is the wisdom of the declining power. By the way, that would be us. The declining power would be us. In their wisdom, they can nudge the rising power to a system that you actually both get benefit from, and although we'd be the junior partner, nice things would happen. You got to remember something. That's the same scam they ran on Richard Nixon at the end of Vietnam. Same guy, Henry Kissinger. Remember, go back in time. Soviet Union was a rising power. We had taken our off the ball in Vietnam. We had to have a SALT agreement. We had to have détente. We had to have a rapprochement, right? They were a rising power. They were going to be, this giant economic power. And Ronald Reagan got in office. And what did Ronald Reagan do? A guy named Andy Marshall, this group called the Net Assessment Group in the Pentagon. And Bill Casey, a former Wall Street deal lawyer, head of the CIA, said, you know what, something doesn't feel right here. They got the CIA, they got DIA, they ran the numbers. They came back with a startling conclusion. Oops, we made a mistake. The Soviet economy is only 1/2 the size that we thought it was. And that 50 cents is the single most important moment of the Cold War. Because Ronald Reagan said, well, hang on. That means they're smaller than California. Why are we so afraid of them? I understand they got nuclear weapons. They got stuff all over the place, just like today. But they're tiny. The whole Reagan defense plan, the 600-ship Navy, I was there. After I came off sea duty, right, in the Pacific, hunting Soviet submarines. Came back to the Pentagon as a junior officer, aide to the Chief of Naval Operations. Saw day one when I got there, the Reagan War Plan. It was about victory. It wasn't about any rising power decline. I said, we're the United States of America. Remember he told Richard V. Allen, we win, they lose. All the CIA analysis coming off that said, if we do this right, in 40 or 50 years, they will decline. Make it 8. Okay? Same exact thing today. One of the more prominent hosts of CNN, I had lunch with him a couple of weeks ago, right before Christmas. And he said he'd had a lunch with one of the senior advisors to one of the leading Democratic candidates in 2016, and said they got it wrong. They can see in 2 years, with the beginnings of this trade war, right, of what Trump's doing, that in fact we were not in decline. In fact, we have all the cards, right? We can determine the outcome of this. We can determine in this great hegemonic, great power conflict what side wins and what side loses. That is Donald J. Trump. In 100 years, this is what they're going to remember. They're going to remember this great conflict between the two greatest powers the world's ever known. And if we continue on and don't get forced into some, optics trade deal for the stock market, where we end up, buying $2 trillion. They promise $2 trillion of things. The stock market goes up. It never happens. Because you got to remember, we've been tapped along for 20 years. Now, how did that happen? They mock Donald Trump every day on TV about foreign policy, national security. He's not acceptable. He's an idiot. He's a moron. We know better. We've had 9/11. We've had a war in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's cost us $7 trillion. And let me add, we got 10,000 combat troops in Iraq, and we got 50,000 in Afghanistan. 14,000 of our own, 7,000 in NATO, and 30,000 contractors. Okay? 17 years into a war that we just spent $62.5 billion last year. What would Philadelphia look like if you took half of that? Gave Philadelphia, inner city Philadelphia, $30 billion. Because I can tell you, when I sat there and say, hey, I want to see the use of proceeds, spent $2 trillion in Afghanistan, I'd like to see the use of proceeds. This place has got to be paradise. I want to see the schools. I want to see the schools for the girls. I want to see the hospitals. I want to see the roads. Because $2 trillion is a lot of money. $850 billion of your money, the deplorables, $850 billion spent on the Afghan army and the Afghan security force. And yes, this will be the same Afghan army and the Afghan security force that will not deploy and go out and attack the Taliban today. The same Afghan military and the Afghan security force that shot the Secretary of Defense of Afghanistan right before Christmas and wounded General Scotty Miller, who we sent over as the new head of American troops. That, the guys that beat Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great, the British at the top of their game, the Russians. We took the world's greatest fighters and turned them into the world's worst army. That's this. It's not about political affiliation, trust me. I'm a right-wing military hawk. And in the West Wing and in the National Security Council, you read it, I was a dove. I was saying, hey, folks, hey, because the apparatus that you see every day mouthed by David Ignatius and Admiral Stavridis and Richard Haas at the Brookings Institute and the Council on Foreign Relations and the conservative places too, it's not about ideology. It's a expeditionary, humanitarian military tied into this global system. And what Trump is saying is that a system of individual nation states in partnership with the United States in that area of the world where it's a vital national security interest of the United States and a vital national security interest of the local people. China's forced technology transfer, intellectual property theft, the Confucian Institutes, right? The non-trade barriers where we can't get into their markets. All the scams that they're running with these companies, taking pension fund money into companies, we have no earthly idea what the use of proceeds are. We have no earthly idea what their values are. All we know, it's way off of what they started when they did their IPO or their reverse mergers. The working men and women in this country understand that's what Trump won Pennsylvania, that's what Trump won Ohio, that's what Trump won Wisconsin, that's what Trump won Michigan. The two differences in the campaign, we focused back to every vertical. We focused where immigration had the biggest impact for jobs. We focused on where manufacturing jobs and the opioid crisis left. And we focused on where they had the highest combat casualties of these wars. That's where we knew the Trump message would resonate, and it did resonate. And they admit today they missed it, right? Remember, this tariffs is just that's just the top part of it all. And tariffs are more than just a tax on goods. It's about human dignity and self-worth. J.D. Vance, if you want to read one book about the sociology of the Trump movement, Hillbilly Elegies, which J.D. Vance, a Marine Corps officer from Yale, wrote about his family, an extended family. He cites these studies done at Harvard and MIT that say there's a direct correlation between the factories that left, the billets and jobs that went with them, and the opioid addiction crisis. We have working class people with no more hope, no more future. We've gutted the industrial West. And who gutted it? Wall Street and corporate America and Silicon Valley gutted it. And it's outrageous. The influence operation on the President of the United States today through organs like the Wall Street Journal and CNBC. You know, every day, hey, the stock market's up because of a trade deal may be announced, right? We're talking about the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years of setting something right that we've taken our eye off the ball for the last 20. Remember, the day that we sign the World Trade Organization to let them in, from 1946 to that moment, compound annual growth rate of the United States economy was 3.25%. Through wars, recessions, 3.25%. From that day to the day Donald Trump raised his hand on January 20th, 2017, 1.9%. Now, there were a lot of reasons for that, but the most significant reason is that Wall Street and the pension fund money of the workers was invested in turning Japan into an industrial powerhouse and de-industrializing the United States. It's the most important issue of our time. And there's more misinformation about it, and people aren't engaged in it. And that's why, hopefully in 2019, I'll have the opportunity to come and to speak to more audiences like yourselves. Remember, you're the heir of the revolutionary capital of our country. We're not an imperial power. Over there, they warned us all the time, we're not an imperial power. We're breaking off from an imperial power. We're a revolutionary power. And that's the single most important thing today. We're not an empire, okay? We're not an idea. We're a country with a border and land and people. And particularly our most important resources is not the capital, is not the land. That's all fantastic. It's the backbone of our society is the deplorables. The working men and women that in the Revolution and in the Civil War and in World War I and World War II and in Vietnam and in these endless wars we're fighting in the Middle East have been the backbone of that. And if we take care of them and focus this and focus on the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, just like Ronald Reagan, we too are going to have victory. Thank you very much.
You describe a tremendous challenge, a tremendous threat. There's never been a situation in the history of the world, as you've described, rising powers and current powers, that were as economically intertwined as the United States and China have become in the last 20 years. You might have done those things differently and we might not have gotten that intertwined, but we are today. There's not a person in this room whose house isn't filled with goods made in China. If we were to try to thwart their plan, as you described it, it could involve an economic dislocation of an unprecedented nature, much beyond the costs that economists are already ascribing to the tariff. So I'd like you to be a little more concrete. What would you have us do to stop their economic juggernaut and to regain sort of economic independence in the way that you see it?
So the central part of what President Trump, I think, is trying to do, and people like Lighthizer and Navarro, the overall strategic thing was to get, because there is a logic to this, and part of it is to get NAFTA done first. The whole part is to shift the world's supply chain back from East Asia to the industrial democracies, are a big part of it. That's why we're negotiating a bilateral deal right now with Japan. We're negotiating a new bilateral deal with Korea. We're eventually, Juncker came over in the summer of last year. We're going to negotiate a bilateral deal with the EU and with the United Kingdom when after they do their no deal hard Brexit on March 30th. it's it's to turn Mexico, Canada, and North America into one geostrategic supply chain base. The key part of the deal was really, I think, the Mexican part, supported by and actually driven by a populist, socialist new president of Mexico that really took out the ability for China to game the system and get goods up through Mexico. So that was kind of step one, and that'll come to the Congress in the spring, and there'll be a huge debate about it, and everybody will talk about it, etc. So it's to shift that back over. I think between a combination of, remember, we're not trying to destroy China. What we're trying to do is get China to stop its overwhelming destruction of the West, economic, right? Because it's turned us into a tributary state. That cannot be. A country's economy is the basis of its power, right? And you must be a manufacturing juggernaut to be a power. We had this debate all the time in the White House between, Gary Cohn and Steve Mnuchin and other guys. I worked at Goldman Sachs. I have tremendous admiration from them. There's a whole different philosophy. Can you be a service economy? Can you be an economy that's just based on services and finance versus you need a manufacturing base? So I think that, over time, that value chain, the supply chain, will come back. Is there going to be some dislocation? There might be. But got to remember, China right now is a house of cards. You got to think about how we got in this situation. On 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock in the morning on September 17th or 18th, I think it was 2008, remember Paulson and Bernanke go into the Oval Office and they tell Bush, we need $1 trillion of cash. $1 trillion of cash by close of business, or the American. But the House of Sod almost falls, and it's nonstop on MSNBC. In China, there's been 500 elites in 2018. Suicides, falling from 40-story buildings. The chairman of H&A, the largest financial company in the world, falls off a wall, right, in France at a church. Overseen by the head of Interpol, Chinese, who's now disappeared. Top actress in the world, can't find her, right? Jack Ma fired from his job. A consolidation of power. Head of Macau security. 500 Chinese elites in a consolidation of power by a radical regime. Crickets. Why is that? Don't think that just happens because it happens. It does not happen because it happens. The influence operation on this, and I'm not a conspiracy theory guy, okay? The reason this system, the party of Davos, the way they roll is the way they roll. It's all out there in front of you, right? The nullification project, what happened today in Britain? No Brexit. Trump, every day hammered from a different thing, trying to impeach him, got a big report coming out. They're trying to take his, the Southern District of Manhattan's going after him. He's being attacked by all these lawyers. The nullification project, right? The system's just not going to sit there because you win one election, pat you on the head and say, what a great idea. Here, Bannon, Trump, here are the keys. Go do what you want. Doesn't work like that. They fight back. What the system in England's pretty simple. The Goldman Sachs, the City of London, the global corporations want another vote. They want a do-over, right? Just like they want to do over here. They got a do-over in 18, beat Trump 52-46. Change the House of Representatives, going to have a huge impact on Donald Trump's presidency. It's a nullification project. But it is not a conspiracy. It's in your face. So when I hear about all the faults of the greatest country on earth that every day has worked to make that better, all I say is MAGA.
So the voters, as you've said, the voters engaged in this nullification in November. And many would say that was a rejection of Trump. You said before the election that it was a referendum on Trump, that
Absolutely.
It was Trump's first re-elect.
Absolutely.
Well, he lost.
He did lose. That's
Why?
what I think. And people go on Rachel Maddow, their heads are lighting on fire. Democracy's over. Remember, democracy's over when Orban starts winning elections with 2/3 of the vote. Salvini starts winning elections with 2/3 of the vote. When Brexit happens, when that happens, man, we got a problem. Democracy's over because these populists and nationalists are winning. I said from day one, and I said, I'm proud of 100 days out on Hannity. He said, how many? I said, today you held it 35 to 40, right? Here's what it was. It's the great thing of democracy. The Time's Up movement, the resistance, and Tom Steyer's, group, they went out and out-hustled us. I don't think the Trump campaign and Trump ever got focused on making it a referendum himself. It was kind of a little bit all over the map. But what they did in May, June, and July is when they knocked on doors. They registered voters, then they went back and gave more information, and then they got them out to the polls. They won exactly like we won in 2010 with the Tea Party movement, and exactly like we won with Trump. Trump came out of nowhere. That was all grassroots. The left, and particularly the more progressive left, won that election the old-fashioned way. They outworked us. And I've said, and I've told all the guys who associate with Trump, in this state of Pennsylvania, which I believe if Donald Trump does not carry in 2020, he will not be president of the United States. That he has to carry this. And the only way you're going to do it is a grassroots effort. So we lost fair and square. I'm not sure it's a rejection of his economic plan. I think they have definitely a different set of ideas, particularly about how Trump governs in the House of Representatives, which you could not lose. And I said from day one, don't focus on these Senate things. Don't focus on the governorships. They're important. I would love to have the governorship of Pennsylvania. It'll make 2020 much easier. But you lose these House seats, and it could be over. And you're seeing right now that there's a new sheriff in town, but that's democracy, right? You got to get back up, and you got to dust yourself off and get back on it. I am quite proud of the fact. I disagree with him ideologically, but someone like Cortez, she doesn't know much, and what she knows is all wrong. But she's got what you can't coach. She has grit. She had, $17,000 against a guy who was going to be Speaker of the House. You know what she did? She knocked on every door. And she gets slammed in her face. And she went back and knocked again. That's leadership, right? She's going to have a huge impact, I think, and others like her. I think that's great for American democracy. I don't agree with Miss Cortez, right? But I love the fact of how she did it. It's just the Tea Party of the left, right? People are engaged. They're more engaged now. Trump remember what he did, what Cortez and Tom Steyer and the resistance and the Time's Up movement, they understood something about Trump that the Republican establishment didn't believe. They understand he's a transformative figure and a historic president. Not just with the judges, but with the deconstruction of the administrative state. That he was going to be in their personal lives 10, 20, 30 years from now. It's a Kafkaesque nightmare, right? Trump will never leave unless we force him out. That's where they knocked on the doors. They out-hustled people. They outworked people. I think there's 25 or 30 seats that were lost by a total of like 47 or 50,000 votes. That's hustle, grit, and determination. And I tip my hat to them, and I think if we don't get back up on the horse and focus on the grassroots, all power in this country ultimately comes from the grassroots, right? And that's what I think today is turning about. You're not going to persuade a lot of people. People kind of believe it. Maybe some in the middle, but it's turning out those people that believe in you is the most important thing. So I think democracy in this country is healthier than it's ever been. But we had 113 million people. I had a not-for-profit. We modeled it. I think we were thinking, 80, 90 million votes. The participation numbers were blow-away numbers. So I think we're in healthy and good shape.
Going to turn to questions from the audience.
Sure.
Who do you see as President Trump's biggest threat as a Democratic candidate in 2020?
So here's the way I think it's going to play out, right? And with the Democrats, I think you're going to get President Trump will be forced farther and farther, I think, to the right, particularly as we go through 2019. And although we have a healthy democracy, I think 2019 looks like it could be the most vicious and vitriolic year in American politics since 1856, which was bloody Kansas and Senator Sumner getting his brains beat out on the Senate floor. I think we could be in for that because I think this is going to be very rough, right? So but I think if you look at the contours of it now, Trump will get forced more and more to the right, and you're seeing a little bit of that currently in the wall debate, right? I think that clearly the energy is on the progressive left side in the Democratic Party, where you have O'Rourke and Warren and Bernie Sanders and Kamala Harris and others. I happen to think they're going to have a start with 45, but narrow it down pretty quickly, but have a real punch out. I don't think a moderate will really make it through, a Bloomberg or a Biden. And I think you'll have somebody quite far on the left. And I happen to think of that group, that both Kamala Harris and O'Rourke could be very formidable candidates. However, I happen to think right now you're going to have, if you look at Bloomberg and Romney and Biden, I think they're going to come back and make an argument to the American people. You have the xenophobic, nativist, racist, misogynist Trump movement, right? And you got a bunch of left-wing crazies that want to, socialism. We have to have not a third party, but a one-time national unity party. If you look where Bloomberg put his money in 2018, it was very successful. Put about $100 million in the back of a guy named Seth Moulton, a quite liberal congressman from Massachusetts. I made a film about years ago. He's a war hero in the Battle of Jaffa, a tremendous young man. They picked some of the best candidates, and I think that they are going to argue in the summer and spring, fall of 2019 that they need a one-time unity party of a Biden or Romney or a Klobuchar. I don't know who it'll be, but it'll be a party because everybody will be so sick of Trump versus the far left. They'll say we need one time to bring the country together, right, and kind of proceed on. And so I think right now O'Rourke but I do think, I said this about Avenatti on the Bill Maher show a couple months ago. What they are looking for and what they need is a fighter like Trump, right? They need somebody to engage and really fight. And I think that you're going to see who that's going to be, I think, in the next couple of months. Somebody who's really engaged and can really fight and can take Trump on. That's what I think they're going to be looking for.
Okay, a couple of questions back on foreign policy. What role do you see for Taiwan in the economic war with China?
Well, as you remember, we took the call from Taiwan after taking calls from the other nation, took the call from Taiwan, and there was literally a meltdown by the CCP. They flew over immediately and said, the territorial integrity and sovereignty of China is never to be questioned. I happen to believe that as we engage now in this economic war and it becomes obvious that we're going to win this economic war, I think the third phase, the kinetic, which they never wanted to go to, I think we have 3 areas of concern. I think Korea is a huge area of concern, not North Korea. I think the whole South Korean peninsula of those guys saying, hey, maybe we opt out of the system. Number 2 is Taiwan. Number 3 is the South China Sea. So I think Taiwan's a tremendous ally, very important ally. I happen to think that we've treated it very badly. As a naval officer, we would pull into Taiwan all the time, which we wouldn't do today. So I think it's very important. I also think it's going to be a flashpoint in that kind of South China Sea along those islands, the free navigation of the South China Sea. Obviously, I think it's in the vital national security interest of the United States, and Taiwan's a period of that. But I think there could be some very dark days about, if you read the Chinese literature that comes out, they're not shy about saying, working up right now, even talking about Taiwan and maybe even potentially downrange a military intervention.
Good or bad that the president pulled out of TPP in terms of our relationship with China?
I think it was excellent. I was a big advocate of that. And the reason is it would tie us up into another one of these amorphous things that we don't know really what we're getting into, but we got more obligations. What it was immediately was a re-engagement in that area. Remember, we've got carrier battle groups down the South China Sea we never had before. The reason the admiral's talking about taking them out, okay, is because they're steaming back and forth, opening up free navigation. We're challenging the Chinese. And we've immediately, looking to re-engage. Remember, South Korea with the election of President Moon was kind of their Brexit. It was kind of opting out of the Chaebol system. We've done more than ever to re-engage with South Korea and talk about wanting to have a new bilateral deal. Remember, Trump's thing of economics and military being combined for national security is a huge leap in Washington, D.C., because they try to bifurcate them. That's why they always focused on the arms situation in North Korea. What the Trump program was is no. North Korea is a vassal state of the Chinese. The overall war is we're engaged with Chinese. They're a vassal state. That's why Kim keeps going to the Home Office all the time to get instructions, right? But back in the old days, it was just, oh, we have to use that separately. No, it's all part of that conflict. And I think Pompeo and the president are doing that. And that's why I think Korea, we're finally starting to make some movement in it. So, I think we've got, in that regard, some tough years ahead, but now we're at least engaged, right? I think we have to be engaged.
What would be more effective, a wall or prosecuting employers for hiring undocumented workers?
This is a great point. So here's my recommendation. I've said this for a long time. We had the problem in the internet stocks. Remember the internet stocks in the run-up and when everything went, pets.com and all the stuff that was all online, it turned out to be worth zero and all $7 billion. When it imploded, Congress acted. Sarbanes-Oxley. Now what cleaned that whole mess up? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the CEO and the chief financial officer have to sign the quarterly financials under criminal penalty. Once that happened, it's a miracle. All the problems went away, right? I have advocated from day one, we ought to do the same thing in immigration, right? We ought to do the same thing in immigration. We ought to have a Sarbanes-Oxley where the CEO and the chief operating officer have to sign under criminal penalty. The burden's on them. It's not on us and ICE agents and the Department of Labor running around. That's playing the game. No games. How about this? You're going to hire American citizens, or you're going to hire legal aliens that are here in some sort of work permit or whatever. But we got to cut the game. So listen, I think they're both needed, but principally we need to start at the corporate level and have more enforcement. We have more ICE raids and all that, but essentially, I think in all this, I think we have to make the elites start to take responsibility. Have to take responsibilities in capital markets, have to take responsibility in corporate behavior, have to take responsibility in this thing of illegal immigration. Got to cut the magnet out, right? So I think that that's absolutely essential. And to me, I would be a huge advocate and will be in the future of this kind of Sarbanes-Oxley for this to make sure that the people that should be responsible have to act accountable.
Okay, what does success look like to you in terms of America's relationship with China? What's the goal?
I actually think the goal is to have a governing apparatus that has what I call the Deng Xiaoping faction to it, which believed in collective leadership and partnership with the United States, right? That and not trying to have some hegemonic war. I think that and I'm a non-interventionist, but until there's regime change of this radical clique, this radical cadre of President Xi that just claimed himself president for life, Wan Xishan, who I might add, Michael Bloomberg in Singapore right before Thanksgiving, got up on a stage like this and said, this is the most important and powerful man in the world. Another one of our elites that I think got to be called into account for his handling of China. I think that there's got to be, and we won't have peace until that thing is sorted. I happen to think that that'll be sorted in the next couple of years, right? I think there's tremendous turmoil in China, and I think that they understand the value. I think Deng Xiaoping is one of the most amazing and impressive individuals of the 20th century that had many great leaders. And what he did with China, what he did with ending the era of Mao and the Cultural Revolution, and what he did 50 years ago this month, right? I think next week on the 29th when he came and saw President Carter. Most of you in the room remember that, and really had an era of good feeling and working together. I think that that's what it looks like, and it's a fair and open system, and it frees the Chinese people. Chinese, and I've spent a lot of time over there. I've lived in Shanghai. I spent many years in the service there and in my investment banking days. I love China. My whole reason I left Virginia as a young boy is to see Asia and to see China. I love China. I love the Chinese people. It's really their freedom. And I don't think it'll come in democracy. I think this concept of rule of law is what they're all asking for. What exactly are the rules and how can they be, implemented for everybody? I think that is, once we have the rule of law in China, I think it'll all work itself out.
Why do you attribute job loss in the United States to China rather than technological change? Didn't the latter result in more job loss?
Look, so everybody gets to this one too. I mean, it's a great question, but it's so, everybody says, why are you worried about this? You got to worry about the robots, artificial intelligence. We're at the beginning stages of the fourth industrial revolution, right? Already in Silicon Valley, and so they consider the working class and even the lower white collar middle class, they call them the useless class. We're hurtling towards an era, right, of advanced chip design, robotics, artificial intelligence is going to be radically different. They had this report the other day, 40% of the existing jobs are going to go. We can't lose the fact that we shipped our industrial might to China. We have to get that back. In getting that back, we understand that the factory of the future is going to be different than the factory of today, but we must get the manufacturing process back here under our control, right? So that we can have all the innovation we used to have in the shops and wandering around. And we're going to have a very tough time. We're going to have to go through some real perturbations, I think, in the coming decades with this advance in artificial intelligence. If you really read the journals and talk to and this is why this genetic scientist in China was another guy that went missing after he did the experiment. There's a book called Homo Deus by the same author, the Israeli author, did Homo Sapiens, and he did Homo Deus. And what he argues in that, and I think if you talk to the guys in Silicon Valley, within the life expectancy, I think, not of ourselves in this room, but probably the people just younger, we're going to get to the post-Homo sapien, right? And what I mean by that is some combination of artificial intelligence, genetic engineering will advance the species to something beyond the species. That's going to be a major inflection point of mankind and a problem, okay? A big problem. And that's what you see hurling right now. And all I can tell you about artificial intelligence and robotics, it's increasing at an increasing rate. And nobody knows where this thing plays off. And if you listen to people like Elon Musk and other guys in Silicon Valley, and particularly some of the defense contracts that are coming out, this whole concept of artificial intelligence and 5G and what the Chinese are doing, it's going to lead us down to, I don't know, maybe an arms control agreement or something, but it's rapidly, and it could overwhelm us very, very quickly. So technology is huge, but I think we've got to get the manufacturing base back, and then we'll implement the technology improvements here under American supervision.
Two questions left. I want to go back to the phrase you've used a lot about deconstructing the administrative state. So the modern American state, many would argue, eased America's suffering in the Depression, saved the world from Hitler, went to the moon, extended civil rights, won the Cold War, cleaned the air and water from its worst days. In other words, the modern American state's done a lot of good things.
Yes.
What do you want to deconstruct about it?
What happened is that, and that's a smaller state that's more powerful. I'm not an anarchist, and I'm certainly not a libertarian, right? But what you've had is that the progressive left came up with a great concept, how to get away from elections, right? So they created this thing, the administrative state, that's just not the alphabet agencies, but also even in the cabinet positions, that they have their own, when you see laws that are 2,000 pages, remember the Federal Register of really how the law is going to be implemented is 100,000 pages. They have their own legislative branch. They have their own enforcement branch. They have their own administrative judges. You have a completely massive fourth branch of government that the founders never thought of. It's the reason Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, Scalia ended with conservatives, kind of the Roe v. Wade and the gay marriage, the social stuff. This concept of the Chevron exemption, which is about administrative law and who has power, the courts in judgment or the administrative courts. The Chevron exemption is the throughput that connects Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and other judges that will be named. Because what they're going to do with the White House counsel's office is start to take apart that bureaucracy. This is much more than deregulation. This is about taking apart a fourth branch of a government brick by brick. And it's one of the most successful parts of the Trump administration that's never talked about. I happened to be with one of the lawyers today. There was a White House counsel, he's back here at a Philadelphia law firm. That was one of the leading people in this task force and what they've accomplished already. So no, the state in the American government, in the American state has done tremendous things, and we're going to do tremendous things in the future, like confront China, right? And make sure that we have free navigation in the South China Sea. We're not an anarchist. We're not saying we shouldn't have any government, but the government today is so overwhelming and so in every aspect. That's why in deconstructing, we're trying to unlock the animal spirits, right? And the kind of motive force of capitalism. That's what's going to do it, is to take apart that part of the state that suppresses that. And that is going to be the alternative to the AOC, Bernie Sanders, all that, which wants more state. They want more intervention. That's what the debates, I think, are going to be populist in nature about what form of it. A more entrepreneurial that tries to give the little guy a bigger piece of the action, right? Versus just this kind of nanny state that just overwhelms you both economically and in your personal life.
Okay, last question. You've obviously said a lot of things very positive about President Trump, his agenda. This questioner wants to know, what are your thoughts on drawbacks of Trump's America?
Trump's America? I think Trump's America is, oh, the way President Trump, listen, I think that, like tonight, I mean, how many times have you had this discussion? There's so many things that are really relevant to the world and where we're going that the mainstream media, people just don't want to talk about, right? President Trump is a disruptor. He was elected as a disruptor. Doesn't mean a destroyer, doesn't mean to bring it down, doesn't mean to bring the temple down around you, but a disruptor. In that, in any type of, at the same time, we're going through the beginning of this fourth industrial revolution, which is disruptive in and of itself, right? So it's a time of churn and uncertainty in the world. But if you believe in freedom and you believe in self-reliance and if you believe in the individual, as we've always believed, right? You can, in some sort of collective way, see our way through this. So is Trump America's got problems? Yeah, it's got problems. But would I rather be on our side of the football? And let me give you a specific example. 2 years ago, we wouldn't even talk about China because it was too big a problem and there was no solution. So the foreign policy elite said, hey, we're just going to kick the can down the road. We'll have more strategic economic dialogue as they steal. Remember, the forced technology transfers, of Boeing and Apple is $3.5 trillion over the last 10 years. That's independent, I think, McKinsey studies. That doesn't include the intellectual property theft, which is another $3 trillion. That's $6 trillion in the last 10 years of going to the heart of American capitalism, which is our innovation, right? 2 years into it, we've got them on their back foot. They're coming to Trump and begging for a deal. That's in 2 years. That type of engagement. And here's the beauty of it. This is why I'm not an anarchist, and this is why, look at Huawei. If Anbon Insurance Company and H&A are really the front organizations of the money laundering and influence peddling of the Chinese Communist Party on a global basis and all the financial capitals of the world, which it is, Huawei and ZTE are the technology arm of the PLA. And yet the apparatus convinces our allies in Canada to arrest the CFO of Huawei. And by the way, when I said she's not just the CFO, she's the daughter of the founder. It would be like if Bill Gates also owned the Pentagon, right? It'd be like arresting his daughter. So that shows you the state at work. And it also shows you we've had a massive sea change. That would be inconceivable 2 years ago. We now have the apparatus is engaged. Read Mike Pence's speech at the Hudson Institute. All forces of government engage in this conflict with China. And that shows you that the apparatus is engaged. The Justice Department, the State Department, the Defense Department, the Intelligence Department. Huawei's executive in Poland today, or yesterday, arrested. And they said, oh my gosh, the Huawei guys fired him. Says, you know what, we think he might be a spy, right? They're all spies. They know that, we know that. But it's 2 years ago, there wouldn't even be this discussion. We were having Huawei help build the 5G network in the United States of America. So we have huge problems, we have huge issues, but they're all solvable, right? We're all solvable. You know why it's solvable? Because of Cortez. We got that grit, we're going to win, right?
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
We're adjourned.
Thank you. American financial system is going to melt down, and the global financial system is going to melt down in 72 hours. Because we didn't realize that when we let Lehman go into bankruptcy, it was the commercial paper market. It's all inextricably linked. This thing's imploding. And what happened and what bailed us out? The most progressive president in the history of the country, Barack Obama, agreed with the Secretary of Treasury and others. And over time, the balance sheet of the Fed at that moment was $880 billion. The balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, when Donald Trump raised his hand at noon on the 20th of January 2017, was $4.5 trillion, right? We just inflated our way out of here, okay? And by the way, that's not free. Remember what we did. We have to be very conscious of why the deplorables are so mad. You know why they're mad? Because they're rational human beings, right? Number one, that's why a savings account has zero interest. Remember, for 5,000 years in the Judeo-Christian West, you wanted people to be good householders. Get a wife, get a mortgage, get a couple of kids, get into the system, right? Form a family, get into the system, and save money because it's going to build up. Now, if you save money, you're a sucker. It's zero. That's the inverse of that. The other thing is the pension liability. We have $6 trillion of unfunded pension liability. Why is that? Because there's no juice in the lemon, right? Richard, you go back and read the notes of the Federal Reserve, they lay it all out, where everybody says, whoa, what got us out was that the elites, bailing themselves out, let's call it what it is, the hedge funds, the real estate holdings, let the devil catch the hindmost, particularly the working class and the middle class. It's the reason the millennials, it's kind of neo-feudalism is what I call it, right? Because you're not going to own anything. You're not going to have a chance to own anything. So the ECB did the same thing. The Bank of Japan did the same thing. The Bank of England did the same thing. Go back. In college, you all took economics. You all had look at Samuelson's textbook. It's worthless. They never talk about zero interest rates, negative interest rates. It's a concept unknown, except when we did it for the last 10 years. But the argument is, well, hold it. We got bailed out because of that and China's 10% growth rate. It's all ephemeral. China just turned up the spigot, just printed money. $35 trillion of RMB. The U.S. banking system, and you bankers can correct me, I think the U.S. banking system, total assets are $19 trillion. The most regulated banking system in the world. And I would respectfully submit that maybe 10% of those assets maybe are non-performing, but we kind of haven't agreed upon, look the other way. Otherwise, we'd wipe out all the equity in banks, so it's $19 trillion. In China, it's $49 trillion. Now, we've hermetically sealed China through the Swiss system and others. We've hermetically sealed China, so when it implodes financially, it can't bring down the whole system like Lehman Brothers in the commercial paper market. In 2008, I think it was $5 trillion. $44 trillion of loans and credit, plus additional $35 trillion of RMB. Why do you think they're in the Persian Gulf cutting deals? Why do you think they're in sub-Saharan Africa? One Belt, One Road is not just predatory capitalism like the East India Company, right? To basically entice the elites and get these countries under debt they can't pay off. It's also, they pay the workers in RMB. In the Middle East, they're offering, hey, you can't get Aramco public. You can't get that $2 trillion valuation from these guys in the city of London or Wall Street. We'll do it, but you got to take RMB because they print so much. It's a house of cards. It's time the American elite and the financial elite of the party of Davos are held responsible for what they've done. We had a financial collapse in 2008 and nobody paid the price for it. Not one partner at a law firm or an accounting firm, not one partner at an investment bank or a commercial bank really lost any equity, maybe had a delay of a year or two in a bonus. Financial crisis we're going to face that's coming up is going to pale in comparison. What are we, $45 trillion of leverage? China's, which no number comes out of there makes any sense, and we just agree upon it. And Wall Street keeps pushing it. And what are they doing in the Oval Office every day on TV? For Trump, you got to get a trade deal, have to get a trade deal. You got to let them off the hook. If you want to see what we're up against, go to the White House site. Navarro and Lighthizer wrote a 50-page report called Chinese Aggression in Technology and Manufacturing. It's up there on the White House site. It'll take you an hour to read it. You read it, you'll see how they've come after us and how we have to fight back. But the elites in this country, particularly the financial elites, have exacerbated the problems in Beijing, and to me should be held accountable for that. And there will be some dislocations, to answer your question.
Thank you. Let's turn to Russia. I want to put aside the questions about investigations and conspiracies, and I want to talk about your view of national interest when it comes to Russia. So there's been a point of view that's been ascribed to you, and I want to know if it's true. And that is that we should not view Putin's Russia as essentially a hostile power determined to undermine the United States, but rather as a potential ally united by a common threat from jihadi forces in the Islamic world and mass migration from Africa and the Middle East. Is that view correct? Is that your view?
In Reagan's time, Soviet Union was the size of California. Today, Russia's economy is smaller than the state of New York. Okay? It's in a demographic death spiral. It creates nothing, no real technology. It's got a lot of bad guys that run it, a kleptocracy, right? Of KGB guys, kleptocracy, and they have a lot of weapons. And they want to get it on. Okay? I spent my youth on a Navy destroyer hunting Soviet submarines, right? Went back to the Pentagon in the early years of the destruction. And back then, the Soviet Union was a big enemy, but I never saw the hatred. You're in Washington, D.C. and say anything about Russia, they want to lock you up and say, Russia ultimately is a natural ally with a Judeo-Christian West. Okay? And I realize they're bad guys, they're bad hombres. You got to keep your eye on them. But there's no need for us to get up into Syria to start fighting them. We got bigger fish to fry. We have an enemy in the CCP, in a country that's been around for 4,000 years, that is so sophisticated in its economy, so big, right? So different in our system, and is pointed and wants to take the system that the Morning Joe crowd and the Council on Foreign Relations crowd love so much. It's just different. It's difference in degree and in kind. And so no, on the surface of it, yes, it's a kleptocracy. They're bad guys and they do stuff, but it's the size of New York State. It's not China. And China, you got to keep your eye on the main thing because you're going to get a lot of things. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't be focused on Russia. And by the way, we had a chance at the end of the Cold War. It didn't happen. We had every opportunity to do this. For whatever reason, it didn't happen. It was the end of history, right? Where our elites, remember, this is one thing that I think the Trump movement mocks and ridicules the experts so much. No great power in history has ever survived the mistakes the elites have made. And I'm not blaming any political party. It's that combination of elites and national security. 9/11, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the financial crisis, right? And at the same time, we financed the rise of China to the detriment of financing our own industrial plant and productivity. No great power has ever survived this. If we do it, it's because the deplorables in this Trump movement has gotten back to what are the core basics of American greatness and what we need to do. So that's why I hold these people in contempt, and that's why, yes, I think Russia over the long period. And if I said this in Washington, D.C., their heads would be blown up. Rachel Maddow right now, Bannon's an agent of the Russians because no, but to me it's just logical. And you never hear these people talk about China. But Russia's the size of New York State. A lot of bad guys, a lot of bad weapons, but we can handle it.
So you've described an alternative view of world order based on the nation state. The phrase that the campaign and the president has used to summarize that is America first. I want to ask you about the language. Right? So we all know the historical antecedent. That phrase comes from Americans who were, in the 1930s, either pro-Nazi or at least took the view that we should be neutral with respect to the war between Britain and Nazi Germany. Even if one wanted to accept the worldview, why use that phrase? Why go back to a pro-Nazi phrase?
Well, first off, I think there's a huge break in American history, right? That people today, I don't think have, except for guys like you, myself, people in this room, don't make even a tenuous connection to Lindbergh and to those guys. And I'm not sure they were pro-Nazi as much as they saw a different order, that they didn't mind fascist power and the rise of fascist power, which is, I think, a slight difference. But America First, I think, resonates because it's not America alone, it's America first. It's America's interests first. This is what economic nationalism is about. This is what the deplorables. It's not that we're not going to be good neighbors. It's not that we're not going to be great allies. It's not that we're not going to get into these international organizations and help them thrive. That's the thing with Trump. Trump is not an isolationist. We're more engaged in the Middle East than we've ever been. That's what we had to remember. When he first trip he took, Riyadh, Israel, Riyadh, Jerusalem, Rome, right? To show the Muslim nations that we're there, but we have to start focusing on the financing of radical Islam, the expansion of the hegemonic, of the expansionary power of Iran or Persia, and also the issues of modernity of the religion of Islam. So I think and I agree, there's some sensitivity. I wasn't around when that phrase was created, but I'm a big supporter of that phrase. And I think it kind of encapsulates particularly how the American people can think about it. It's not America alone. It's not America out by herself. It's not America on some island, but it is putting the national security interest of the United States first. I want to add one thing. I think technically it's very important for you guys to understand, because we're talking about the wall now, this national security emergency, potentially. Remember when Trump first won, because of this thing about American decline, remember, the elites in our country were comfortable with managed decline. That's whether it's in healthcare or education or a southern border, right? Our culture, our position vis-a-vis the world, particularly with China, they were comfortable with managed decline. That line of demarcation is working class people and middle class people saying, we're not comfortable with that. We're not comfortable with an elite that is comfortable with managed decline, and we want disruption in that system. When we first took over, people said, hey, look, all your ideas in China are nice. They're interesting, but there's nothing you really can do to engage it. And that's what we said, oh, you can't? Well, on the books is the national security crisis or emergency powers of the President of the United States. And they're supreme. Remember, the founders didn't want a king in this very city. You're the heirs to it, argued right here. Going to have checks and balances, right? Checks and balances, except when there's a national security emergency. Remember, Lincoln fought the entire Civil War. Never had statutory power for any of it. It's all an executive order. He never went and convinced anybody. He deemed as commander-in-chief and president of the United States, he waived habeas corpus, right? He shut down, he totally did away with the First Amendment, shut down all the printing presses in Ohio. Remember that? The Copperheads? He freed the slaves with an executive order. The same exact thing as Trump's travel ban is what freed the slaves. I think it was 2 executive orders that freed the slaves. The reason, if you saw the movie Lincoln, they got to get a change to the Constitution is they understand they have to get a statutory change, or somebody later on, like with Trump, can undo it. I think it was Lincoln said the Constitution is not a suicide pact. What we did is said, this is a national security problem because China is at war with us. China is at war with us. And they laughed. Remember, this came out in the summer of July and August of 17, and it deals with this state, with Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania. It was steel and aluminum, the 232s, 234s. And the big one was the 301 on technology. Remember, the Wall Street Journal at first goes, what are these guys are crazy? They're talking about national security emergency with steel, with aluminum. They're not saying we're crazy now because they understand the scale of it. They understand the issues with it. And they understand Trump was right. He predicated the forced technology transfers in the 301 and about the overcapacity and destroying the global steel and aluminum industry. And he acted like somebody like Lincoln acted, using his executive powers. The same executive powers he's going to use, I think, ultimately on the wall. And you'll start reading, you'll start seeing on CNN and MSNBC this thing called the National Security Emergency Act of 1976, along with, we just had this issue with the War Powers Act about Yemen here shortly. I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a constitutional scholar. But I think they're going to find, because both of those were done to contain someone like a Nixon, if we ever had that situation again, that you couldn't have some madman come in and do all kind of crazy stuff. He had to be constrained. I think, particularly given the Supreme Court justices we're putting up that are Federalist Society textualists, that go back to the original documents of the Constitution, and I think that they're going to see, eventually this is all going to go up, because if Trump calls a national security emergency on the southern border crisis and tries to go build the wall, it's clearly the Ninth Circuit, it's going to be the travel ban all over again. A huge constitutional fight. And I'm of the belief that they're going to find that Trump's just like Washington and Jackson and Lincoln and all of them. He's got, remember, they didn't say that the commander-in-chief had to go make a case. In his sole discretion, he could do it. And he did it on China, and that's why, quite frankly, today we're winning. Because not just our countrymen, but the world's capital markets thought it couldn't be done. And the Chinese didn't think it could be done. Now they understand it can be done. And they understand there's somebody in Washington, D.C. that has the power to do it.
I'm going to come back to the wall.
Yes, sir.
I want to explore your concept of the grievance of working class voters who voted for Trump and the populist movement that's led to. So I want to read you a quote which a lot of people might find sort of indistinguishable from the views that you've described here. Here's the quote. "You're a slave in your own country. Each year you get to keep less of the fruits of your labor. Each year it gets more difficult to carry the burden that aliens have placed upon you. Each year the cheap labor of aliens makes your future less secure." That is from George Lincoln Rockwell's 1967 book, White Power, the leader of the American Nazi Party. How is it wrong for millions of Americans to believe, as they do, that the concept of populism you've described is neo-Nazi?
Simple. The people have been destroyed by mass illegal immigration. And remember, my greatest enemies are in the Republican Party. It's Republican establishment, Chamber of Commerce, right? We were the heretics. I actually said, the people who have been destroyed by mass illegal immigration are working class African Americans and Hispanics, right? The unskilled labor pool. That people want a bigger pool of unskilled labor. Keeps wages down. The whole point, that's part of the Trump miracle, is now that we're starting to try to restrict mass illegal immigration, you're seeing wages rise. And lo and behold, yesterday in the Financial Times of London, we have a Fed chair who's not going to sit there and panic at the first increase in wages, particularly in construction, in agriculture, and oilfield services. They're the ones that are the most destroyed by that. They're also the ones destroyed by unlimited, or what we've had to, I think, heretofore, virtually unlimited legal immigration. Remember, we've turned the entire education system in this country over to the STEM program. Science, technology, engineering, math, we teach for the test. But African Americans and Hispanics have a very difficult time, if not impossible time, of getting into engineering schools and then getting jobs in Silicon Valley. Why? Because we bring on HB1 visas, of which the president says he wants to make it easier. I happen to radically disagree. The 1980s, when I was at Harvard, had this concept of the maximization of shareholder value. That was the mantra. That was turned into a fetish. Everything was about that, the maximization of shareholder value. The populist movement has one concept, the maximization of citizenship value. Economic nationalism doesn't care about your color, doesn't care about your race, doesn't care about your religion, doesn't care about your ethnicity, doesn't care about your gender, does not care about your sexual preference. All of that is irrelevant. What it cares about is one thing. You're an American citizen. You're an American citizen, you deserve a better deal. Okay? The whole burden's on your shoulders. The whole burden, right, of this civic society. Think about it. Most of you are in finance, or a lot of you are in finance. What do we talk about? Why is the dollar so strong? Why do people want to invest in the United States? They said, oh, it's the liquidity of the American capital markets. And I said, but what underpins that? Why is that liquidity? They said, well, everybody wants to invest here. Why? Because it has a safe and stable civic society. That is all on the shoulders of the deplorables. That's why they're so angry. That's why they're so angry. They help finance the deindustrialization, right? Look at the concentration of wealth we got. It can't go on. This is neo-feudalism. Look at the millennials. They don't own anything. They're not going to own anything. They don't own any houses. The family formation, reason the demographics is so upside down, regardless of race, is because of late family formation. Why? It's the economic angst of young Hispanic couples and African-American couples and white couples. They can't form families until late. Why? It's a gig economy. Right now, the statistics show they're 20% behind where their parents were at the same stage in life. It's only going to grow over time. With no pension plans, with $9.6 trillion gap in pension funding. There's no pensions. There's no retirement. We don't know if there's going to be a social security system. We've had a concentration of power and wealth that the gentleman down the street that did the Declaration of Independence and came back and set up this magnificent Constitution would be outraged today if they came back and saw this. That with everything we've accomplished, the average American, they just did this thing on the hurricanes. Half of the families in America can't put their hands on $400 in cash. If you take out the equity in the home, which is, I think, fairly ephemeral, I think the average American has $10,000 saved up for retirement. It can't go on. Don't trust me. Just look at populism is the future. It's either going to be right-wing populism of deconstruction of the administrative state and using capitalism and giving the little guy a piece of the action, or you're going to have Bernie Sanders and AOC. That's coming. They just smoked us in the midterm elections. It was 52-46 when you aggregate it up. I think 50% of kids under 25 years old think socialism's fine, right? It's logical. They see a gig economy. They don't see careers. They don't see futures. They see going from one gig to the next, never owning everything, never getting into a house. It's neo-feudalism. They're better fed, they're better clothed, they're in better shape than 18th century Russian serfs, but there's no difference in them because all they're doing is on that wheel, right? The wheel that made debt so easy. Forget the college debt, which is, nuts in and of itself. I'm talking about the consumer debt, right? And that's where we are. The founders would be disgraced. That's the power of populism. It has nothing to do. The people that want to go against it, the identity politics crowd, it's Nazis, it's neo-Confederates, it's all these fascists. It's the least fascist thing out there. Remember, fascism worships the state. The Trump movement's core principle is the deconstruction of the administrative state. It's to free up entrepreneurism. It's to free up capitalism. But let's have real capitalism. We don't have capitalism in this country. We have socialism for the very wealthy because we've socialized the risk. It's bailed out all the time. I point to the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. Remember, one thing you don't get about the bravery of Donald Trump, I think he may only just have realized it, is the quantitative tightening. Remember, in Obama, we had the spigots open to liquidity. When he sent that tweet out in early December, said, stop the 50 Bs. Remember, we've been doing, I think it's $360 billion. We've been quantitative tightening for 2 years or 18 months. Trump is trying to logically deflate the asset bubble so it doesn't implode, right? In an act of, I think, financial courage to try to get this thing sorted. So, no, I reject that. It's not just out of hand, it's absurd. Economic nationalism, and you're going to have populism. It's either going to be right-wing populism or you're going to get O'Rourke or AOC or Bernie Sanders or some sort of, and you see, they're all about state intervention. I mean, you've seen their plan and they're pretty straightforward about it.
All right, so let's drill down a little on immigration, which obviously you've put at the heart of a lot of things. We have, in the United States, a declining birth rate among native-born Americans, below replacement rate, which leads to an aging population. A lot of people would tell you that immigration, fairly open immigration, is the answer, not the problem, to productivity growth and to a healthy economy going forward. Who's going to do the work? Who's going to take care of
Here's who's going to do the work. We have to solve the economic problem. I'm not against immigration. What I'm against is immigration that just comes in and competes at a level for the tech jobs, et cetera. I think we allow, what is it, 1.5 million legal immigrants in a year? It's not that we're shy about that. We have more immigration, I think, than any nation on earth. But just assume, oh, the birth rate's down, family formation. Why is that the case? It's the case because we have a neo-feudalistic economic system right now, that all the value is taken up to the top couple of percent. And then you have this base of, very poor that's taken care of. Everybody in the middle has a Darwinian form of capitalism. Let's solve for that part of the equation. And then let's see family formation of native-born people, of African-American descent, in Hispanic descent, right? In French descent, in Irish descent. I just don't say, because, the birth rate's down. The birth rate's down because there's economic angst. And we owe it to our citizens to solve that. Look, I adamantly fought the tax bill. It's pretty well documented, right? I'm a populist. I didn't think it was the way to go. It had certain elements on the corporate tax rate to make us competitive with Germany and China and others. But I'm not opposed to putting a bigger tax burden on the wealthy, people that make money. We got to do something. Because if you look at the program of AOC and the others, they're talking about a fundamental redistribution of the assets. They're going to go to a European model at its start and then roll from there. And we're going to have all the nightmare of socialism, right? The way to solve it is to solve for that part of the equation where we start to have family formation. We start to have a robust society. We can do this. It's not that, look, if we can take on China in less than 2 years, have them on their back foot, and they're on their back foot. They're begging for a deal. If you had said that at the beginning, during the Trump campaign, if you had said we'd have China on its back foot and actually shown that we can drive the course, and people laughed in your face. All the experts have said that's impossible. It's not impossible. We're the most powerful nation on earth. We're the most powerful nation in the history of the earth. There's nothing that we can't accomplish, and we can certainly accomplish this. And yes, if we need immigration, look, here's the thing. If we don't solve for that, if we don't allow and have, I went to land-grant university before I went to Georgetown and Harvard. I went to a land-grant university engineering school, right? Today, I think my engineering school is 75% Asian, South Asian. It's not because it's not because the Hispanic and black and white kids, working class kids aren't smart enough. It's that those countries they're paying $45,000 a year and their nations are financing it. The local kids pay $12,000 a year. So that arbitrage, that finances, part of the reason finances the school. We have to make sure that inner city Philadelphia and St. Louis and Detroit, right, get a shot at Silicon Valley. That's one, it's the right thing to do. We owe it to our citizens to do that. They're our number one priority. They're our number one priority. And that's what you should fight for every day. And we're going to have to do this. I worked at Goldman Sachs in the merger department. I understand higher operating margin leads to higher stock price, leads to bigger bonuses for executives. I got that part. I can do the math, right? Maybe the margins are not so high. And I think people freak out about that, but we'll catch up with productivity at some other time. But there's got to be, this system we have today cannot continue and will not continue.
Okay, 2 more historical quotes about immigration. In 1924,
So I know we're going to get to some real fascists now, not just Lincoln Rockwell.
We're moving. In 1924, the governor of Georgia, Clifford Walker, spoke to the Ku Klux Klan convention. And he said, America should, quote, build a wall of steel, a wall as high as heaven against immigration. In 1989, in his farewell address to the nation, President Reagan, who you fondly referred to,
yep.
President Reagan said America was, quote, a shining city, a city with free ports that hum with commerce and creativity. And if there have to be city walls, the walls must have doors, and the doors should be open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here. It sounds like you agree more with Governor Walker than with President Reagan?
Well, no, I think that, we have a crisis on the southern border, and now the wall has become symbolic or totemic, right? But we have to talk about what that crisis is. I mean, we're either a sovereign nation or we're not a sovereign nation. It's Obama and money from Obama that helped build part of the wall, is Bush and others. We've had a consensus in this for a while. If people thought that, the system we have today or some sort of variation of it could continue on, and remember, it's the black and Hispanic working classes it's the education system, the healthcare system, particularly in the southern states. But the effects of the immigration is up in Ohio. It's up in Michigan. It's the opioid crisis. It's the crime. It's all of it. The world's got 7.5 billion people. What, 5 or 6 billion would like to live in the United States of America? I don't hold that against them, right? I've been a person from day one that said this is a biblical tragedy. What's happening not just in Central America, it's happening in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, this is a global crisis. But is the solution in sub-Saharan Africa among the working class people of Italy or Hungary? Is the problems in the Triangle Nations of Central America on the working class people in Texas and Arizona and New Mexico? The answer is no, it is not. And we have to be more engaged. President Trump just allocated $10 billion for aid to southern Mexico and to the Triangle Nations. I don't even think that's enough. We have to get engaged there. We have to help them make their countries great again and solve it. Just like I had dinner last night at my place with one of the senior guys in the Italian government. And they talked about Italy's commitment, corporate commitment, and its government's commitment in sub-Saharan Africa and in Libya and in Niger. They get it because guess what? As he said, the issue is not tanks running across the Fulda Gap in the North German plain. The problem is in the Middle East and in Africa. And we have to solve that, but we have to solve it together. So we can go through as many quotes as you want tonight. No. You got to understand, I do this all the time, right? I do this. That's fine. But this is just a way to avoid the problem. The problem is that we have a political asylum system, right, for political refugees. Mm-hmm. And then we have an immigration system for people who want to come here for a better life. It's just the practicality is everybody that wants a better life, we can't have into the country. The math just doesn't work like that. But we have a very fair, I think, today, and the president clearly, with Tom Cotton and others, want to have a more merit-based system, right? And I'm a supporter of that. But we have to stop the mass illegal immigration because the people that are damaged by that are not the people in this room. It's not me personally. It's the African American and Hispanic working class in our country.
Let me talk about two more of the
Can I get another quote? I
No,
gotta have one more quote.
no
Say another
no
one.
more quotes.
Give it to me.
Fresh out.
The governor of Georgia was a
good one, huh? So I want to talk about you've repeatedly talked about, and obviously the phrase "Make America Great Again," the idea of a kind of a glorious past. So I'd like to ask you to sort of be specific about when you believe, either from an economic point of view with respect to average American, average standard of living, what it costs to buy a car, what it costs to live in an average size house. And even more importantly, perhaps, in terms of the fairness of our society, right? When was it better? We had earlier generations in which there was legal racial segregation, legal discrimination against women, outright criminalization of sexual minorities. When was it better?
I think the story of America is a story of glory because we overcame, right? We overcame this. Look at Lincoln when he fought the Civil War. Remember, Lincoln is a true economic nationalist. When Lincoln fought the Civil War, which eventually became a war not just to keep the country together as a nationalist, but became a crusade to free the slaves and shadow slavery. At the same time, which they couldn't do in 30 years and they fought over, he financed and started the Transcontinental Railroad. He passed the Homestead Act that allowed people from throughout the world to come over here. If they work for it, they got the land for free. And he passed the land grant university, which opened up universities to working class people. I think our past is glorious. And this kind of nonsense, and that's nonsense. Yes, we've had problems. We've had racial discrimination. We've had all of it. And we fought the bloodiest war, one of the bloodiest wars in mankind's history, to free the slaves, right? I come from Richmond, Virginia. That's my hometown, okay? I've seen what happens when you get crossways with the United States of America, right? It doesn't end well. Remember, Lincoln and Sherman and Grant eventually came to the conclusion they had to physically destroy the South and the planter aristocracy to free this country. And they destroyed it. They burned Atlanta to the ground. They burned Columbia, South Carolina to the ground. They burned Richmond, Virginia to the ground. That still didn't solve discrimination, but we've gone through. It's a glorious past. It's the most glorious past of any country in mankind's history. And I find it interesting today when we're trying to return to America's, the better angels of our nation, our past, that the Trump people and the deplorables always play out. They're racists, they're nativists, they're xenophobes. There's not one word said by our elites, not one word said about our enemy. China is a totalitarian dictatorship as bad as Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Okay? They've already got 1 million people in slave labor camps with the Uyghurs. And that's not even counting what they've got with their own people, the social credit with the facial technology. If you go online and look at the videos every day. When I'm in London, a Russian gets poisoned and the tabloids go nuts. Khashoggi gets murdered and cut up, and that's all